If you have finished sewing all of your blocks, you might think that it's time to sew your blocks together, but unfortunately it's not quite that simple. First, you're going to need to square up your blocks, or maybe even fudge your blocks. In an ideal world, all of your blocks will finish at the exact same size and you'll be able to skip the squaring up process. But fabric isn't static like paper. Paper is pretty predictable. It doesn't stretch or anything. But fabric, on the other hand, does stretch, and it'll stretch differently depending on which direction you're pulling. And sometimes you'll get tucks and folds in your fabric, and your fabric might just overall act in an unexpected way. So quilters pretty much always need to measure and square up their blocks, especially if they want their quilt to lay flat. Ideally, our blocks will finish at 10 inches by 16.5 inches with perfectly straight sides, all four sides. But because we were trying to be consistent with our seam allowance and not necessarily focusing on getting a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, there might be some variation in your blocks. So if your blocks are bigger, you're going to trim down to 10 by 16.5, and if your blocks are smaller than that, you're going to trim down to your smallest block, okay? As you can see here, this is the 16.5 inch line, so this block is about 1/4 inch too long. And on top of that, the edge has a slight curve to it. And if this edge has a curve, there's a possibility that there is a curve down on this side too. So when it is time to trim, I'm going to line up the 1/2 inch mark on my ruler with the line that goes across the bottom of the mat. And then I'm going to line up the side with the 16.5 inch line. And then I'm going to do something called overcutting, where I push it to the side maybe 1/8 inch, all the while making sure that this line is perfectly lined up with the mat, and then I will cut that edge. When that edge is cut, I'm going to turn it around, line up my straight edge there, and then I will cut exactly on the 16.5 inch line for this side. So I will have straightened up both sides of the block. While you're trimming, always be super aware of your perpendicular lines. So while you're cutting this line, make sure that this line is always matched up and straight. Because if you cut this line perfectly, but this side is at an angle, you're going to have a wonky block. And I tell you, that is very frustrating. So let's say you have a block that came out pretty wonky along these edges, like this one I've got over here. I was having some issues with stretching on the first blocks I had, and I came out with this sort of wonky edge where things weren't meeting up and some strips were longer than others. I'm going to fix this by seam ripping the block completely apart and re-sewing it using the techniques that I used to make my other blocks to prevent them from stretching. But I know that there are going to be people out there who do not want to do that. They will avoid seam ripping at all costs, even though seam ripping is your friend, and they're going to want to fudge this somehow. They don't want to redo the work that they already did. So I will show you how to fudge these blocks. First of all, you cannot fudge just one block. If all of your blocks are the right size, 10 by 16.5, but one of them you need to trim down and make more narrow by, let's say, like 1/2 inch. You're going to narrow that block, but then it's not going to match up with the blocks in the same column. So you'll need to make each of those blocks narrower too, with a total of 4 narrower blocks. If, however, you're having to make a block shorter, like this, you're going to have to make 5 blocks total shorter, and then distribute one of each of those blocks in each column. If you're planning on doing a more complicated arrangement like this color blocking here, that means you have to be a little bit more strategic about which blocks you end up trimming down. If you're doing something more chaotic, it won't be as big of a deal which blocks you end up trimming, because it's just going to be, random. And also, after you trim your blocks, I recommend that you label them in some way so that you know that those are your fudged ones and you can arrange them accordingly. Okay, let's say this is the block that you want to fudge. I would start by getting my length, the correct length, what I'm aiming for with my blocks. So I would get it to 16.5. If you're having to remove a big chunk of fabric, I would say take it from the bigger piece. So whichever end of your block has the bigger piece of fabric, because the more fabric you take away from your smaller strips, the less is going to show up in your block after your seam allowance. So you would trim that up, and then I'm assuming that everyone is going to be using, or most people are going to be using, the 6x12 ruler, especially if you're new to quilting. So you will want to match up your nice newly squared up edges and fold it in half. And then on this edge down here, you want to make sure that there is no fabric that's been tucked or folded strangely. You want just one fold so you don't get a jagged cut down here where the fold is. Alternatively, if you feel like you're going to want to keep quilting and you want to invest in some more rulers, I would suggest you get this big guy, 6 inches by 24 inches, and then you don't have to fold your block. And you won't have to worry about getting a jagged cut where your fold is. You can just use your nice long ruler and make that cut without a fold. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you're trimming this side because it's wonky, chances are this side is wonky too, even if it's not quite as obvious as the wonkiness on this side. So make sure you trim both sides. And when you're trimming, you're trying to trim off the least amount as possible. So keep an eye on where your narrowest point is and then trim to that side. And then when you turn it around, you're going to do the same thing. You might think that a trim needs to look like this, but a trim can be as small as like 1/8 of an inch. So try to be frugal with your cuts and just cut off the bare minimum of fabric. You don't need to cut off 1/2 inch to be square. Hopefully you won't need to cut off that much. So keep an eye on your narrowest part of your block and trim both sides. I should probably add just a little bit of a disclaimer here. Not all blocks are fudgeable. You can't fudge every block. For instance, if I tried to fudge this block and I took maybe just 1/8 of an inch off of each side, that 1/8 of an inch would eat into my seam allowance. So when it came time to sew this to like some sashing or another block, I wouldn't have the 1/4 inch that I need right here, right here, right here, everywhere around my block. So I would lose the points of all of those pieces that I so precisely sewed together. So that's one reason why that the more complicated a block is, the more precise you need to be, because you just can't fudge it the more complicated it gets. So just for a quick review, if you're going to fudge your blocks, you can 1, trim them all down to the size of your smallest block. 2, if you need to narrow one block, you're actually going to need to narrow 4 blocks, and they'll all be in the same column. And 3, if you have to make one block shorter, you actually need to make 5 blocks shorter and put one of each of them in each column. And also remember to label the blocks that you fudge. You might find that your block slips a lot while you're trying to trim it. You put your ruler down and then all of a sudden everything is askew, and it happens over and over again. I definitely had this problem, and I ended up using a sort of paperweight on this end of the block and then trimmed on this end. So go ahead and look around your sewing space and just sort of find like any random heavy thing that might work. So some spray starch, a lightweight, I think this is like 5 pounds maybe or less. My collection of clips, anything like that. Maybe your phone would be a good idea, but anything to put a little bit of weight on this side of your block. Another option would be to use a little bit of tape. If you have painter's tape, I think that would be even better, but you could line up your block exactly how you want it, and then put just a little bit of tape on the end, and it's easy enough to pull it up and readjust when you need to. And then it doesn't wiggle as much, and maybe you might want to put it in a couple different places, or maybe you find that you're mostly slipping this way, so if you put tape down here, you're good to go. So whatever works for you. I know it can be really frustrating and a little intimidating to cut when you know that everything keeps slipping and sliding everywhere. So I encourage you to look around your sewing area and see if anything within reach might solve this problem easily for you. Before I start sewing my blocks together, I like to try out several different layouts just to get a feel for what I like and what I don't like, and it also helps me not regret my choices or second guess my choices later on. There are a bunch of different ways that you can lay out your blocks to see them really well. You could lay them out on the floor. That's what I did when I first started quilting. You can get a sheet of flannel and tape that up onto your wall, and then your blocks will stick onto it. What I'm using is called a design wall, and it is not a nice one. A lot of things went wrong when I was making it, but it works fine. It's just not great to look at. Basically, it is batting on the top, and that is glued down to some foam board, and then I have command strips that hold it all against the wall. If you want to make one of your own, there are so many better examples of them out there on the internet. Full tutorials with lots of tips and tricks for a better design wall than this one. Now let's look at a couple different layouts. This one, the way I have these blocks arranged right here, it's just the order that I finished them in. So I want to do something random, but with a little bit more thought. And also I want to separate my blocks. These are all block 1s and these are 2s and 3s. So I want to mix it up and do a really random layout. To make this random layout, I separated all of my blocks into 5 piles with 4 blocks per pile. I just sort of mixed up each pile and then tossed it up there onto my design wall. And you'll probably notice over here my ironing board, I like to use it as like a staging area. I'll stack things on there and then I can move it around as I move around. So overall, I like this layout, but I don't quite love it. I want to try a few more things out. If you like the very first layout that you do, take a picture of it. Always take a picture of the layouts you like, because when you move your blocks around and you move on to new layouts, you might forget what you did that time before or the first time you tried it out. And then you'll be kicking yourself wondering, how am I going to recreate that? In this layout, I went from light to dark, from side to side, light to dark. You could also go and start up here and go down diagonally light to dark, but I think this was a little bit more easy. You could also move your columns around so that maybe your lightest one was in the middle and then it got darker as it went out. Okay, so I like this layout better than the first one I tried, and I've already taken a picture, but there's one more layout that I want to try. So the columns go from light to dark, and then dark to light, and then light to dark, and so on down the way. I think it really distributes the values pretty evenly and makes a really balanced looking quilt. It's kind of funny that I like this layout because it looks balanced, the way that the colors are organized, because the previous layout I liked because it looked unbalanced. In the end, it's just sort of like an intuitive sort of choice. You just choose the layout that feels right for you, and for me, it's this one. So all of my blocks are squared up. I've found a layout that I like. Now I'm going to need to label my blocks so that they don't get mixed up when I'm sewing. This time around, I'm going to use my masking tape. I think painter's tape would probably be better, but I don't have any. But I'm going to label these up and then I'll show you what that looks like. You can go ahead and label every single block in each column if that makes you feel more comfortable, but I just did the first block and then the third block down here because I'm going to be sewing them in pairs. So I basically labeled the first pair of blocks I'm going to sew together and the second pair of blocks I'm going to sew together for each of my columns. One tip I should probably mention is that you should use a pin that isn't going to smudge, especially if you're going to be using lighter fabrics, because you could accidentally stain them. So use something nice and reliable and non-smudgy on your labels. I also made sure to place my label well away from where my seam allowance is up here. So it's down here, and I also made it towards the top of my block instead of the middle to sort of indicate that this is the top of my block. Now I'm going to pair up my first and second blocks, remember right sides together, and then my third and fourth blocks right sides together, and I'm going to use my ironing table for a sort of staging area. And I'm going to do it for every single column, so I'm going to do it all at once for a total of 10 seams for my first round of sewing. If you've labeled your blocks clearly and accurately, it shouldn't matter what order you sew your blocks in. Just remember to keep your seam allowance as consistent as possible and still aiming for that 1/4 inch seam. Turn on your audiobook or maybe Netflix and be patient and go slowly. In the previous video, I mentioned thread nests, but I didn't have one to show you. But here's one, a pretty spectacular one. So my choices here are to either seam rip or to just cut off the excess thread and then pretend like it never happened. Normally with a very simple block like this, I would probably just neaten it up and ignore it. But I did get off. My fabric got misaligned while I was sewing, so I'm probably going to seam rip that and redo it. So my blocks are looking pretty messy. I chain stitched them and they're all connected still, so I need to cut them all apart. And then I'm not going to press them yet, and I'm not going to put them back on the design wall over there. Instead, I'm going to just open them up, look for my label, and then I'll match them up with the corresponding block. So this is 4B, so I would match it up with 4A. And then I'll take it right back to my sewing machine, and then I'll have a total of 5 seams to sew for this round of sewing. And then after that, my columns are going to be done. Keep in mind when you're matching up the 2 halves of your column, you have your top half and your bottom half, and you don't want to match it up by just flipping it over like this, because that means that if you were to open up that seam, you would actually have the top of your column meeting the middle of your column. So instead, you make sure you have the right pair together, 3A, 3B, and you're going to scooch all the way down to the bottom of the first half. This is the part that you want to meet in the middle with your second half. So you're going to want to make sure that they go together like this. And then you can flip it over, have the right sides together, and match up that edge. Okay, and you can always double check when you're piecing. Do you have 2 labels touching? So this has no label, this does. As long as they're the right 2 halves, you should be good to go. So here I have the 2 halves of each column paired up, and they're looking pretty long. Look how far they dangle down there. And I have gone through and I've double checked that they are matched correctly. Just peel back this corner, make sure that you have label on this one and not on this one. Okay, good to go. So I'm going to sew this off camera, and we can just skip right to the pressing stage. While my iron heats up, I'm going to take some time to inspect my columns to make sure that everything got sewn together correctly. Make sure I didn't accidentally match up the top with the middle. So I have my 1B there and my 1A up there. And I'm also going to remove this middle label because it no longer matters. And also I don't want to accidentally iron over it because I could get a sticky mess on my hands if this melted. It might make a stain or it might make it difficult to remove. So I'm going to take it off now so I don't make that mistake. And I'm going to do that for every column. So I'll set this one aside and get my next column and do the same thing. I'm not removing the top label because I'm pretty sure I can avoid it. I'm not going to be anywhere near a seam that I need to press, and I still need to know which row is which when I put the columns together. Okay, I have some good news for people who are pressing their seams open. You don't have to do anything special. You can just keep going as you've been going. But if you're going to be pressing your seams to the side, we can do something called nesting our seams. So basically, for each intersection of your columns, you're going to have 3. You're going to want to press this side one way and this side the other. And then I'll show you why later. So for each column, you can be very general and just go up that way, or down that way, up this way, down, up, down. The quilt columns are getting pretty unwieldy. They're so big, so I'm going to show you nesting seams on these little scraps. So for both of these pieces, I've pressed the seams towards the dark. And so say I'm wanting to make a little forepatch, and I want my seams to match up perfectly. All I have to do is turn them over. You'll see on this side, the seams are going that way, and on this side, the seams are going that way. And they're going to meet in the middle like that. And so you just want to make sure that they're butted up right next to each other, those seams. And you can actually feel when they come together all the way down the seam, just like that. So if you're pinning, you would pin right there and right here, and then you'd put it through your machine like this. And then when you would open it up, you would hope to see that those seams were matching up perfectly. There are cases where maybe you have stretching or that got misaligned, the seam got misaligned while you were sewing, but most of the time you can actually feel it when it is perfectly aligned, and it's really satisfying actually. It's actually my favorite bonus to pressing to the side. It's just absolutely fabulous for someone who doesn't use pins, or for someone who really, really, really wants those nice matched seams. So here is my first column. I'm going to be pressing down, or in my case, I'm pressing towards the dark, which is basically the same thing. So I'm actually going to flip mine so the top is up here. So I'm going to find my seam, and then I'm going to make sure down here, can you see, that the fabric is going towards the dark. The fold is towards the dark. Give it a good finger press. Make sure I haven't gotten any weird tucks or folds, and then I can take my iron and just press as I have been for all of my other blocks. So pretty simple. You're just going to want to make sure that you're pressing in the correct direction for each of these. And I promise nesting seams is worth it, especially if you want perfectly matched seams, or if you do pinless piecing. Sometimes you might want to open it up or close it like this, and then open it up after you have it arranged correctly. Finger press, and then press. So here's my second column. For my first column, remember, I started with the top over on this side, but this time I'm going to start with the bottom on that side. So here is the seam between my two blocks, and make sure that it's all going this way. If you look from the back, you can see all the seam allowance is under the dark fabric. Okay, and you're just going to keep doing that for all 5 of your columns, going down one column and up the other column. Okay, this is how it's looking now. All of the columns are finished, and we just have 4 more long seams to sew. If you're going to pin your columns before you sew, I would match up all of the corners of my blocks first, and then if you want additional pins, I'd do maybe in the middle of each block and at the end. There's one more thing I should mention. I was going to try to show you this at the machine, but I couldn't get a very good angle for it. So let's pretend that this is your presser foot. So as you're sewing along, your presser foot will naturally push down these seams that are facing away from it. But when it gets to the seams that are facing towards it, like this one, sometimes it will catch and push it down and sew it down going the wrong direction, which leads to this sort of twisty up portion right here that can create bulk in your finished quilt top. So when it comes time to finish your quilt and quilt your quilt top down to your batting and your backing, it can create like extra bulk that might make you skip stitches or cause imperfections in your quilting line, or some machines might have a hard time going from a smaller, less bulky area to a more bulky area. So it's just easier all around to make sure that when you're sewing, to pay attention to how your presser foot interacts with these seams. If it naturally wants to push them the other way, you can use something like this, a stiletto or a pin, or maybe even your seam ripper. You can use it to just ever so slightly guide that seam allowance under your presser foot so that it doesn't get flipped around. But make sure that your stiletto or whatever you're using doesn't come anywhere near your sewing machine needle, okay? So keep it in the safe zone and just guide it under the foot. Here is my super long seam. So I finished putting these two columns together, and now when it comes to pressing, you can continue to press to the side or you can press open. Another thing you can do is something called spinning your seam. So this is that example I showed you earlier, a little 4-patch. And what you can do is go to your seam and then give it a little tug. You're going to open up that seam. If the way you twist doesn't open the seam, then just try the other way. But you're going to open that up. You'll see that half of the block is going to fall this way and the other half is going to go this way. And you'll have this little pinwheel inside. I still like to do a little finger pressing from the front. Whoops. Like so. And then I'll iron from the back. So the reason you might do this is just to distribute the bulk of these seams instead of folding the bulk of this intersection one way or the other. So it makes it just a little bit flatter and more manageable if you spin those seams open. And plus it sort of is pretty cute. I like how it looks from the back. So go ahead and press your seams however you want. There really is no right or wrong way. People might do things differently for different reasons, but it's not always 100% correct to do it one way or the other, okay? So do what feels right for you, and sometimes your block will speak to you. You'll think, I'm going to press this open, and then when you go to press it open, your block is like, not today. And so you'll press it to the side instead. Try not to take it too seriously and just relax into it. Okay, so let's talk about next steps. So far I have sewn columns 1 and 2 together and 3 and 4 together. And so the next step could be either sewing this column unit and this column unit together here, or I can sew this single column to this column unit. And that's actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to sew the single column to this single column unit, because if I sew this column unit to this column unit first, and then I sew this single column on, I'm going to have all of this quilt top hanging off over the edge of my sewing machine bed, and it's going to add tension and weight, and it might be a little harder to get it through my machine. Not like terribly hard, but enough to be annoying probably. So instead I'm going to sew single column to this column unit, and then sew this unit to these two, if that makes sense. And then it'll be a little bit more balanced and I won't have quite as much weight hanging off over the side of my sewing machine bed. So go ahead and sew all of the rest of your columns together, and make sure to watch till the end of this video because I have a little news about what to expect next from this beginner quilting series. Remember, it is just fine if your seams don't match up perfectly. This is your first try, and I specifically wrote the pattern so that you wouldn't be able to really tell that much if they don't match up. So it'll blend right in if it doesn't match, okay? But I want you to practice it anyway because it's a good skill to have. Okay, if you have sewn together all of your columns, then congratulations, you have a finished quilt top. You can stop here for now until you're ready to start quilting, or you can do one more step, and that step is called a victory lap. I couldn't say who came up with the idea of a victory lap, or if it's a new concept even. I just know that I only recently started hearing about it, like a couple years ago maybe. But a victory lap is, let's look over here at the edge of the quilt. A victory lap is when you sew within 1/8 of an inch of the edge of your fabric on all 4 sides of your quilt. And the reason you might do this is because we do not, as quilters, do back stitching. So it's just a way to secure the stitches that are touching the edge. So these stitches are not back stitched. They might pop open if it's handled a lot, you take it out to take photos, you might find that those stitches are popping open. But if you do a victory lap, you'll secure those stitches. So it's both a good way to celebrate that you've finished your quilt top and also a way to just strengthen those edges and keep it neat and tidy until you get the chance to quilt your quilt and finish the edges. Obviously, our quilts aren't done yet, and neither is this video series. But I am going to take a couple weeks off to give everyone time to get caught up. In the meantime, I'm going to be attempting to answer questions that are in the comments section, and I'm going to try to clear up any confusion I might have stirred up along the way. Then, later on, we'll have another much shorter shopping list, and we'll finish up our quilts. Thanks for spending time with me today, quilters. If you want to support this channel and help me buy supplies and materials for future videos, please visit my Buy Me a Coffee page linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss upcoming videos. And I'll see you again real soon. Bye!